So Alix completed her PhD at the University of Sheffield in 2015 before joining the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies at the University of Bristol in the same year. Dr. Dietzel is a climate justice and climate policy expert, and her research focuses on how just the response to climate changes on both local and global scales. As well as her active teaching and research, Alix applies her research to achieve real-world impact on society, particularly in her role on the Bristol Advisory Committee on Climate Change. And today, Alix is going to be talking to us about climate justice and COP26 and asking, where are we now? So thank you so much for joining us today, Alix. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming to this talk. So, like Amy has said, I'm going to be talking a bit about climate justice, which is my expertise, and then COP26 as well, kind of catching us up with where climate policy is at the moment. So feel free, if you think of questions, to put them in the chat as you go, or wait till the end. Either is fine by me. So today's talk, I'm gonna briefly just, you've done a very good job of introducing me, just say where you can reach me, my email and my Twitter. And like was just said, my expertise really lies in climate justice and global climate policy. And more recently, I've been interested in the question of just transition as well, especially at the city scale. So I'll talk a little bit about that today. I sit on the Bristol Advisory Committee on Climate Change, which is kind of like the National Committee on Climate Change, but at the city scale. And here I advise on matters of climate justice. I'm also the Associate Director for Impact and Engagement at the Cabot Institute for the Environment here in Bristol. That's a new role that I'm really excited about. Our institute has about 600 academics working under it, and I get to lead on impact and engagement for the next 3 years, which is really cool. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about climate justice. So what is it? Because you have probably heard of it before, which is great, because a few years ago, if I would say, hi, I'm a climate justice scholar, people would just stare at me blankly. But more recently, people have kind of come to understand what climate justice is. So I'll just briefly go over that and then go right into what a just response to climate change requires of us. And then a brief overview of science and politics, just to get us on the same page before I analyze what happened at COP26. And a reflection on what this tells us about climate change, politics, spoilers, it's quite depressing news. So in the end, I want to end on a hopeful note, which is on non-state climate change action and cities in particular. So to get us started in thinking about climate justice, climate change is really an obvious, almost perfect example of justice and injustice, because it affects those who have done least to contribute to the problem. So the typical examples of that might be future generations, because they haven't contributed at all since they're not yet born, people living in the global south who have relatively low emissions, and then even people who aren't the richest in more affluent countries, because they have low emissions as well. And people who are kind of lower adaptive capacity, like people in the global south or people who are not rich in affluent countries, they're going to be affected by climate change the most, because they tend to live in regions of the world or parts of countries that will be hardest hit by climate change impacts, and they have lower adaptive capacity, like moving away from the area that's affected or kind of retrofitting their houses to be more comfortable in severe weather, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a kind of perfect, dark issue of justice, and the kind of like puzzle that moral philosophers like me like to think about, because it is so unjust, and we want to think about what could be improved. So because it's an issue of justice, it raises questions. For example, who should do what to combat climate change and to adapt to it? So who should be most responsible? Who should be contributing how much to the solutions? What do we owe to those people who are not yet born or who will be most affected by climate change? And in the kind of climate justice scholarship, that's called distributive justice. So distributing who gets what and why. And there's lots of really interesting models of responsibility that try to answer that question. So for example, the polluter pays model, which focuses on high emissions contributors, the ability to pay model, which says, don't worry about emissions, let's just think about who has the most money and the most capacity, and then mixed models, which kind of look at both factors. So a huge amount of literature on that in my field. There's also procedural justice, which is how do we make decisions fairly at the global and the local level around climate change. So even if you never mention justice or fairness, which is quite rare now because they're more in the vernacular than they used to be, you need to think about, you know, what decision do you want to make and what is that based on? So is it based on a conception of what should be prioritized and for who should it be prioritized? What's most important in our society? And how is that going to be fairest for the most amount of people, for example, or most efficient for the most amount of people if you don't like to talk about fairness? This is an aspect of justice called procedural justice, and procedural justice scholars are really interested in how you can make good and fair decisions, democratic decisions, decisions that are inclusive, decisions that reflect what people in that society or across the globe actually want, etc. So that's another kind of area of climate justice that's really interesting. And then finally, the area that I've kind of gotten most interested in recently, and that's growing more popular as well in my field, but also kind of in society at large, is the question of just transition. So how do we move forward as a society in a fair and inclusive manner? How do we make sure that as we get ready for climate change or start to combat climate change or even just adjust our emissions levels, how do we do that in a way that doesn't leave people behind and doesn't make existing inequalities even worse than they already are? So that's climate change justice in a kind of nutshell, I would say. So if that's climate justice, then what would it look like to actually respond to climate change in a just way? Obviously, this is a really complex question, especially considering all the elements of climate justice I just talked about. But I think to put it simply, there's three main things we need to do. The first is to substantially lower global emissions, because obviously keeping emissions low is important, since the more the temperatures rise, the more dangerous climate change becomes and the more people you have at risk. So as a justice scholar, especially someone who focuses on human rights, let's say, the fewer people at risk of being harmed or having their human rights threatened or dying is a good thing. So first thing is substantial lowering of global emissions. The next thing is prioritization of adaptation. So poor adaptation mechanisms could actually exacerbate climate change effects, perpetuate and worsen existing global inequalities, harm human rights, and potentially result in the loss of life of millions or billions of people. So adapting to climate change is becoming increasingly important as we sort of start to slip away from the possibility of staying below 1.5 degrees, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the next slides. And as climate change kind of becomes locked in and we're facing ahead to having to adapt to climate change. And this is particularly important for those people who will be most affected, and those living in the global south really need that to be prioritized. So I'll talk about what that might look like and what COP26 did to help prioritize adaptation later on in the talk. And then finally, the idea of systemic change. So rapid systemic change, ideally. There's going to need to be changes in behavior at every scale, including the state, non-state, and individual level, and every key industry, including transport, travel, food, and infrastructure. Business as usual basically is no longer a viable approach, and the response to climate change has to be restructured and quickly. So basically, we cannot keep doing what we're doing. We need to restructure really quickly, rapidly, how we behave at almost every scale of our society and in every industry. So these three requirements of a just response I outline in a paper that I published just a few months ago. So if you do want to know more about them, feel free to ask me and I'm happy to send you a PDF. Most of you are familiar with climate change science, but I thought we could just quickly catch up with what's required to refresh your memory. So we hit 1.2 degree change in 2021, and we will probably reach 1.5 degree, which is the current kind of global target under the Paris Agreement that we should stay under ideally within the next 2 decades, depending how rapidly we act, but some estimates, I think, were saying we need to cut emissions by January. So a few months ago, we need to start cutting them rapidly in order to have any hope of staying under. So it is a really urgent thing that we must lower emissions drastically. So to put that into some numbers, to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, global emissions have to peak at the latest before 2025 and then fall into 48% below 2019 levels in 2030, reaching net zero by early 2050. And for all scenarios limiting warming to 2 degrees or below, we have to greatly reduce fossil fuel use, with unabated coal being completely phased out by 2050. So that's from the newest IPCC report. And the kind of reality that we face as well is that there's going to need to be a deployment of carbon dioxide removal to counterbalance hard to abate residual emissions, which is looking increasingly unavoidable for net zero to be achieved at all. And that's mainly because of the very limited emissions cutting at the global level that we've done so far. Adaptation is also going to be key, like I said on the previous slide, because impacts are locked in. And in terms of what countries are doing to prepare for that, 170 countries, climate policies at the international level, so the UN goals, nationally determined contributions, they're called, now include adaptation, but many have yet to move beyond planning and into implementation. So there's lots of nice plans, but the implementation is lagging behind. And the 2022 IPCC report finds that efforts today are still largely incremental, reactive, and small scale, with most focusing only on current impacts or near-term risks. And just in terms of how much it might cost, which could help us have an overview of what the latest COP has achieved, the estimate is that it needs to reach between 127 billion and 295 billion per year for developing countries alone by 2030 and 2050 respectively. Some other estimates I've seen is 250 billion per year. So this is, to me, a kind of low estimate, but the IPCC is a really good authority. So I thought I would quote their latest findings here. Okay, so if that's the science and justice requires us to lower emissions and adapt and have some systemic change going on, what is climate change politics achieving? So you might know that the COPs, which are the Conference of the Parties or the annual meetings, have been going on since 1995. And something really important happened at the first COP, which is that countries were categorized into Annex 2, Annex 1, non-Annex 1, and least developed. And this was a kind of way to figure out which countries would contribute most to climate change efforts. So Annex 1 and Annex 2 were kind of the richest countries at the time. Non-Annex 1 were kind of classed as developing countries, and least developed were the victims of climate change. And what's interesting is that when we started making rules around climate change with the Kyoto Protocol, these categorizations were really locked in. So the view of who should do what about climate change is based on, at least under the Kyoto Protocol, which was enforced until 2020, on categorizations of countries from the early 90s. So big economies like the BRICS nations, for example, are missing from this list of like countries who need to do the most about climate change, which is really problematic. The other problematic thing is that the 2-degree goal, which was the historic goal before the Paris Agreement, wasn't agreed until 2009. And this is also where climate finance was first kind of promised for adaptation, 100 billion a year, which is obviously substantially less than is actually required. And there was this lack of participation. So only Annex 1 countries were responsible for lowering emissions and Annex 2 for financing adaptation and climate change responses. And ultimately, that was a list of about 40 countries. And I think the emissions from all those countries together only accounted for something like 15% of global emissions. There were really weak targets as well, so really below what's required, and very weak enforcement mechanisms. So it was voluntary, you could leave at any time, there was no punishment for non-compliance, and several countries actually left in the second round, for example, Japan and Canada, and the US famously never joined the Kyoto Protocol. So that was like the global politics around climate change all the way up to 2020, when the Paris Agreement superseded the Kyoto Protocol. So not great news. The Paris Agreement looks slightly better Yeah, so that came into force in 2020, but was negotiated and finalized in 2015. It set that new stringent global target. All the policymakers were congratulating themselves about. We're going to stay below 1.5 degrees, but there was a big shift. So instead of having this list of countries responsible for climate change action, Annex 1 and Annex 2, et cetera, what they did, because they couldn't agree on new categories, even though some were floated, like Annex X, which sounds very exciting. Basically, what they said is individual countries should set their own targets, and they will then come together to kind of stay below 1.5 degrees. So this is a big shift in climate policy making, because instead of having this top-down governance system where there is a global target and emissions reductions targets for all the countries, now there's a global target, but it's bottom up. So countries themselves have to put forward climate plans that are reviewed every 5 years. Participation massively increased. So every country in the world has a climate plan under the Paris Agreement, but so far not much has changed, right? So we're in 2022 and emissions have not fallen yet. They fell briefly over the first lockdown, but came bounding back. So even though you've got everyone signed up, what's actually happening? And there's continued weak compliance measures. So like I just said, there's a 5-year review process, but there's no punitive measures and countries can exit at any time. The reason they say, this is important, policymakers say it's important people can leave anytime and it's not punitive and it's voluntary, is because otherwise countries wouldn't sign up to it. It's a feature of global politics, not just in the climate change arena, but it really means there's weak international law around meeting your Paris Agreement targets. So all of this adds up to basically not very good news. So just before COP26, this is from the Climate Action Tracker, which is a really good website. You can see here a list of countries that are either critically insufficient, highly insufficient, insufficient, almost sufficient, and then finally the goal 1.5 degree Paris Agreement compatible. And you can see there's 0 countries there. Yeah. So you have all these grand plans, the Paris Agreement, lots of celebration around that. It looks like a good news for climate justice, but then the reality is that the emissions plans are woefully inadequate. In terms of adaptation, like I said a few slides ago, 127 billion will be required by 2030 and 295 by 2050 for developing countries alone. So that's not even to talk about countries in the global north. In 2009, 100 billion per year were promised starting in 2020. But the reality right before COP26 was that the 3 key adaptation funds set up by the UNFCCC, the Special Climate Change Fund, the Least Developed Countries Fund, and the Adaptation Fund only held a total of 3.1 billion collectively. So a huge gap between what's required on a year-per-year basis and what's actually in those funds. And unfortunately, under the Paris Agreement, no new financial targets were stipulated. So nothing was specified and no countries were assigned specific amounts they had to donate, and contribution to adaptation funding remains voluntary. So that really calls into question whether the pace of fundraising will be in line with what's required, to put it politely. So that's all pre-COP26. So did COP26 change anything? So I have some key outcomes here for you. I'm going to read them from left to right on the top squares and then the bottom squares. So first of all, negotiators finally brought discussions around the Paris Agreement rulebook to a close. So that was good, including regulations around carbon markets and regular reporting of climate data by all countries. So some things were finalized and there was some celebration around that. The Glasgow Climate Pact that emerged from the summit was welcomed by many for its commitment to doubling adaptation finance and requesting countries to present more ambitious climate pledges next year. So some good news there as well. However, others were really disappointed that this COP once again failed to provide vulnerable nations with the money to rebuild and respond to unavoidable impacts of climate change. So that's problems with adaptation funding that I'll give you some details on in a couple slides. And something that was discussed a lot in the news, and you guys might vaguely remember, is that it's the first ever COP decision to explicitly target action against fossil fuels, calling for a phase down of unabated coal and a phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. But I wonder if you also remember how much that wording was argued about and changed. So I have here a diagram for you to demonstrate what happens at these COPs and how nitty-gritty the negotiations are and how much can change, because each country has to agree to things line by line, which can cause trouble. So first of all, on the 10th of November, they had in the outcome document the plan to put a simple sentence. It calls upon parties to accelerate the phasing out of coal and subsidies for fossil fuels. Hugely radical. Remember, it had never been mentioned at all, fossil fuels phasing out in a COP document before this. Since 1995, never happened. So this was really celebrated and everybody got really excited. But as you move down, I'm not going to read it all out to you. I'm happy to share these slides. But basically, as you see, the 12th, the 13th of November, and then the final agreed text, things shifted substantially. So the final thing that actually made it in, it says, calls upon parties to accelerate the development, deployment, and dissemination of technologies and the adoption of policies to transition towards low emissions energy systems, including by rapidly scaling up the deployment of clean power generation and energy efficiency measures, including accelerating efforts towards the phase down of unabated coal power and phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, while providing targeted support to the poorest and most vulnerable in line with national circumstances and recognizing the need for support towards just transition. So this is really interesting because you can see the attempt to be radical, clear cut, getting increasingly watered down, vague language being introduced. And this leads to lots of problems because when you have these kind of ambiguities in the text, it leads to inaction at the global level. So post COP26, the picture looks like this. So according to the IPCC, following the current climate pledges to 2030 would make it impossible to limit warming to 1.5 degrees with no or limited overshoot and strongly increase the challenge for 2 degrees. So again, this is from the Climate Action Tracker, and you can see current policies and actions on the left-hand side in the dark blue, and then the most optimistic scenario on the right-hand side. But even under the most optimistic scenario, we barely squeak under 1.5 if we're lucky, and more likely it's heading towards 2 degree, 3 degree warming. In terms of adaptation, COP26 came shortly after rich nations acknowledged, how kind of them, that they had failed to meet 100 billion annual climate finance targets for 2020, which was set over a decade ago. This failure really framed the negotiations from the outset, and many of the Global South leaders who spoke during the first 2 days drew attention to it, and delegates expressed concerns about a breakdown of trust between parties. So not a good start. The final text does urge them to meet the target urgently and through to 2025. However, it lacks any wording on making up the shortfall in the years 2020 to 2022 when the target is expected to be missed. So again, this watered down language that's really problematic. Pledges made at COP26 amounted to 356 million total, when 127 billion per year at the kind of small end of the scale by 2030 is required. So huge failure. And the final decision on this agenda item agreed to keep discussing long-term finance until 2027, reflecting a lag in reporting that means 2025 finance figures will not be available until 2 years later. So again, kind of kicking this down the road. And adaptation at the minute accounts for just 4 to 8% of tracked climate finance, which totaled 579 billion in 2017 to 18. So what does this all mean? What does this tell us? Well, basically, the UN, I want to be slightly charitable here, has played a really important role in building consensus and catalyzing action at the global level. But a just transition or a just response, I think, is not being pursued at the international level, full stop. It's just a complete failure from a justice perspective in any case. As Haley Stevenson, who supervised my PhD, notes in her brilliant paper called Reforming Climate Governance in an Age of Bullshit, what a title, there is no shortage of declarations, pledges, and policies promising ambitious emissions reductions, and yet emissions continue to rise and mitigations actions fall far short of the ambition required to ensure a stable climate. So in a recent paper that I wrote, I noted, there have been no fundamental changes in state behavior, and there have been no rapid systemic shifts in the global response to climate change. And not enough is being done to respond to climate change at the multilateral level, even if there's continuous, very slow progress forward. So when I was writing this talk, I was thinking, you can't end there, Alex, this is too depressing. So I have a little bit of hopefulness, which is actually the title of my paper. It says, Non-State Actors Hope for a Just Response to Climate Change. A little bit of hopefulness to end the talk. I think there's room for cautious optimism, even in this kind of abject failure of global governance, which is that there's a growing alternative response taking shape at the non-state level. Sometimes this is called subnational or networked, experimental or transnational, but I call it non-state in my work. Non-state actors are basically not states. So it can be cities, corporations, NGOs, even individuals, community groups, all those sorts of initiatives who are said actually to have a significant potential to contribute to the climate change response. And a lot of the recent research is showing that they can lower emissions and or sometimes both contribute to adaptation efforts. And they can also, which I think is more important, significantly shift the context of climate change action and create space for systemic change, which I said was very important for climate justice at the beginning. So to put it simply, there is evidence that non-state actors are fundamentally changing the nature of the global response to climate change. Thank God, because the states at the top are certainly not doing that. So some reasons to be hopeful about non-state action. For one, their participation in climate governance has allowed for an independent and creative pursuit of climate change responses that were simply not possible before they came on the scene. So at the COPs, for example, it's always the same procedural issues. You've got countries from all over the world, diplomats flying in to negotiate with their own national agendas, hangovers from the past, you did this, you did that, and the kind of global political picture that is ever changing and complex, which really hinders action. And for a group of cities or a group of individuals or a group of corporations or NGOs, those kinds of problems don't really stand in the way, and they can be much more creative. They're not only pursuing things in a new and creative way, but they're also often more ambitious than multilateral actors. And they have been known to not just be ambitious in their own right, but actually push state actors directly during negotiations, especially since they've been let into the negotiation room. The creativity, ambition, and innovation of non-state responses has the potential, I think, to catalyze significant change. For example, changes to our growth-based global economic system, to meat and dairy heavy food production systems, and even to our fossil fuel reliant energy systems. Although wide-scale system changes might seem very daunting and indeed impossible, given the current level of inaction on climate change, non-state actors do provide us with some hope that such change is possible. And to give you a kind of concrete example of that, I'll talk a little bit about where I live, which is Bristol. It doesn't all look like this, although this is a nice picture of Bristol in the sunshine. So Bristol is a city in the UK and was the first city in the UK to declare climate change emergency in April 2019, ahead of the UK government, who declared in May. And Bristol's climate change plan is actually far bolder than the one put in place by the UK government. So the UK has committed to cutting emissions by 78% compared to 1990 levels by 2035. And the city of Bristol is actually planning to be carbon neutral by 2030, which is extremely soon, in 8 years. What's interesting as well, for me at least, is reading their climate plan, because they're not just planning to lower emissions. So the One City Climate Change Plan, which came out just before lockdown, I remember going to the launch, and things have shifted a little bit since then. They've done a refresh of this plan. But in this original plan, they called for transformative action and set out to radically rethink how we live, work, and invest in our city. The One City Plan sets out to move faster than the national average and points out that there are entrenched market and wider forces that will support existing fossil fuel dependent consumption-based systems, which have to be challenged. So quite radical language here. There are plans to implement radical system changes across the following areas: transport, buildings, heat, decarbonization, electricity, consumption and waste, business and the economy, public, voluntary, community, and social enterprise services, natural environment, food, and finally infrastructure independencies. So really an awareness of the systems that need to change. And they aim by 2030 to have achieved a fair and inclusive transition, capturing opportunities to of new jobs and investment, improved health, well-being and education, and a better environment for local people. And they define fair as maintaining a democratic mandate, ensuring there are opportunities for all to participate in the benefits of change with its costs shared fairly. And to me, as a scholar who has been looking at the global negotiations and outcome documents for over a decade now, it's really exciting to see this kind of language because it goes far beyond the constructive ambiguities built into international agreements. So constructive ambiguities are where you build in language that is so vague that everyone can agree to it, but nobody really knows what they've agreed to, and things don't move forward very quickly. And I've been studying Bristol recently. I've done a project on just transition and what it looks like. And there are, of course, flaws and problems, but it's definitely an area that I'm quite excited about. And I'm planning to expand the scope of the study to look at a few more UK cities and just transition in the UK more broadly. So thank you very much for listening. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can see me. And yeah, I'm looking forward to any questions.